सलाम पाकिस्तान, मैं हूं इफ्तिखार फिरदौस और आप देख रहे हैं बॉर्डर टॉक्स। नाजरीन, पाकिस्तान बॉर्डर के ऊपर इस टाइम पर एक सिचुएशन बनी हुई है जिसमें दो बड़े कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स रूनुमा हो रहे हैं। अफगानिस्तान के अंदर पाकिस्तान का ऑपरेशन और यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स और इजराइल का स्ट्राइक ईरान के ऊपर, लेकिन दोनों की इंप्लीकेशंस पाकिस्तान के लिए बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। इंपॉर्टेंट ना सिर्फ डिप्लोमेसी के हवाले से बट मिलिटरीली भी। इसके क्या आगे असरात होंगे खित्ते के ऊपर और ये जंगें किस मोड़ की तरफ जा रही हैं। आज हमें ज्वाइन किया है क्विंसी इंस्टीट्यूट के डेप्यूटी डायरेक्टर एडम वाइनस्टाइन ने। बहुत शुक्रिया एडम वाइनस्टाइन हमें जो है वो टाइम देने के लिए। एडम, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल आई वांट टू आस्क यू दैट द न्यूज कमिंग आउट ऑफ DC mostly, and now there is confirmation on the Pakistani side as well, as that Islamabad could be one of those places where these negotiations might lead up to actually. I want to know what actually were the circumstances which made Donald Trump, post that statement on Trueland, and, in terms of what the implications of that are and whether that will hold or not.
Well, I think the reason Donald Trump indicated that he's looking for a diplomatic off-ramp is because there's a lot of economic pain that's being felt, and they don't have a clear end state. I mean, the Israelis definitely want to see some kind of regime change, but for the United States, the end state of this conflict was always left undefined, and I think there was a bit of naivete within the administration that this would be an easy operation or that there might be some kind of uprising inside Iran. And that hasn't come to fruition. So now I do think they're looking for an off-ramp because the Iranians have been able to inflict real economic pain in the Gulf and in the United States.
But in terms of, the United States, what is the internal political scenario? Because we keep on hearing about it in Pakistan from the larger scale on what the global perspective is. But what are the internal politics within the United States that are driving these factors?
Well, the internal politics, about the war is that the majority of Americans don't support the war. The latest polling I saw, and I do take polling with a grain of salt, is that only 7% of Americans would support U.S. troops in Iran. Remember that President Trump campaigned about no new wars in the Middle East, and then he launched one. I believe the Trump administration thought they could replicate what they did in Venezuela, and this would be a very easy operation. It hasn't turned out to be that way, midterms are coming up. So I think President Trump is afraid of essentially losing Congress to the Democrats if he doesn't resolve this conflict soon.
But in terms of the implications for the United States also, if you can tell our viewers that what sort of implications, financial, agricultural, economical, even the oil economy, what sort of implications does this war have, and what sort of measures have been taken even before plunging into this war for the protection of all of it?
Well, the short answer is I don't think any measures were really taken before the war was launched because I don't think they had long-term planning. In terms of the kind of implications that Americans feel, I personally felt it a couple days ago when I went to go fill petrol in my car. Gas prices have gone up. The other implications, life in the United States has remained normal, but I think there's intense pressure on the Trump administration from his Gulf partners because the implications there are far more extreme. The Gulf countries rely on being transit hubs. That's come to almost a grinding halt. They rely on tourism. They rely on being a safe location for the rich people of the world to park their capital. And all of that has come under threat. So I think actually the greater pressure might be from the Gulf allies. But there is some pressure within the United States, including from President Trump's own conservative partners. And a lot of that has to do with rising gas prices and the fact that there have been U.S. casualties.
I agree with that in terms of, but when you look at Donald Trump's ascension into the office, he said that we would end foreign wars, and there were several economic measures that he had promised. How do you see that the internal dynamics with this voting that will take place, how would this war affect it, and do you think that the analyses and the polls so far, do they favor Donald Trump? From what we're hearing, it's not so easy.
No, the polling isn't favoring Donald Trump, although, again, I always take polling in the United States with a bit of a grain of salt. I mean, people will vote based on the economy, but they also vote based on culture wars, and it's going to depend how voters view the candidates that the Democrats are putting forward in the midterms. If I was a betting man, I would say that Congress does swing in favor of the Democrats during the midterms, but we just don't know. This war is not popular in the United States. A lot of people have pointed out that there haven't been anti-war protests. That's true. I think Americans are burned out, and I think Americans, we're not actually a huge protest society, at least contemporary America. There have been some major protest movements in the last, 6 or 7 years, such as the Black Lives Matter protests. But in general, Americans don't take to the streets over foreign policy issues. Gaza was an exception, actually, in terms of the student protests that occurred at universities across the United States. But in general, there aren't large protests related to foreign policy. That doesn't mean that Americans support this war in Iran. Overwhelmingly, they don't.
So in terms of the economic forefront that we see and that's being debated, do you think that the United States requires an exit more than Iran, because Iran has actually made it very clear that they don't want a unilateral and the US started the war, and it was not that then started it and they'll be the one who'll end it. Do you think that's just rhetoric, and behind the doors they're also serious in ending this war?
Well, they should be serious in ending the war because they're dealing with a very unpredictable administration. And I think the Iranians made some mistakes, although I put the onus of the diplomatic failure on the Trump administration because they literally blew up diplomacy twice. But I think the Iranians made some mistakes in the months leading up to this latest round of strikes, in which they were taking a much more maximalist position than perhaps they should have, and I think they had time with the Trump administration, and they simply didn't think that the Trump administration would assassinate the supreme leader, or do something of that gravity. And so I think they should come to the table. But I think the difference is that, first of all, the Iranian regime is not accountable to elections in the same way that the Trump administration is. Secondly, I think they've consolidated power, and they're perhaps even less afraid of a protest movement than they were before. The Iranian people haven't overthrown the regime, and that's just a fact. It doesn't mean that they support it, but they haven't overthrown it. And then, lastly, I think the Iranians view preventing this from happening again as in their vital interest. And so they're not going to agree to something unless they feel very confident that the Trump administration won't come back and launch a war 6 months later, because they might not be able to survive this twice. Whereas the Trump administration, especially President Trump himself, I think, he's had his fun and now he wants to make this go away.
But the perception overall is that the war was initially fought under the impression that the Israelis were pressuring the United States. How much value does this hold, and is it actually the impression true?
I think the Israelis did pressure the United States, but I think we should be careful not to take agency away from President Trump. I mean, he's the final decision maker. He has said no to the Israelis in the past. He could have said no. He can say no again. I do think the Israelis pressured the Trump administration, but I also think President Trump himself had a certain ego and hubris in which, very recently he had essentially kidnapped Maduro from Venezuela, and Delcy Rodriguez had become the new head of state and was essentially a yes woman to the United States and was willing to agree to anything the United States said. And I think that made him a bit arrogant, and he thought he could repeat that in Iran, but Iran is a far more complicated country, and the regime is far more robust than the Chavistas in Venezuela. And I think some of this just had to do with a impulsive decision on the part of the Trump administration, and they thought this would be a lot more easy to achieve. I think the Israelis knew that it wouldn't, but they were willing to convince President Trump to come along for the ride. for the Israelis, it makes, when they have Iranian strikes occurring in Dimona and there's civilian casualties, that's a price they're willing to pay. Because from the Israeli perspective, they see a once-in-a-generation opportunity to remove the Iranian regime, who they view as the head of the snake. I mean, they view the Iranians as responsible for all of their troubles.
We'll flip back to Afghanistan and we just need to take a short little break. नाजरीन, इस वक्त टाइम हुआ एक छोटे से ब्रेक का. अगर मैं समझाता चलूं कि एडम ने क्या कहा, उनके नजदीक अमेरिका में ये जंग एक अनपॉपुलर जंग है, यानी आम लोग इस जंग के हक में नहीं है. सिर्फ 7% अमेरिकी पोल के मुताबिक एडम ने बताया कि वो ईरान के जंग के हक में है और डोनाल्ड ट्रंप की पॉलिसीज के लिहाज से है. लेकिन सिर्फ ये नहीं कि एक्सटर्नल फैक्टर्स हैं, ये बात भी उन्होंने की कि एक प्रेशर था डोनाल्ड ट्रंप पर इजराइल की तरफ से, क्योंकि 40 साल तक तकरीबन इजराइल की डिप्लोमेसी ईरान के खिलाफ रही है और वो इस वक्त तक जितना भी अपनी जितनी भी कुवत है उसको इस्तेमाल करने की कोशिश जो है वो कर रहे थे कि अमेरिकन किसी प्रेसिडेंट को कन्विंस कर सके ताकि वो ईरान के ऊपर जो है वो अटैक करे और एक लार्ज स्केल वॉर हो. लेकिन फिर इन्होंने ये भी बताया और इस बात की तस्दीक की कि एक लॉन्ग टर्म प्लानिंग इस जंग की जो है वो नजर नहीं आती, तो एक एग्जिट स्ट्रैटेजी भी जो है वो जरूरी है, क्योंकि अमेरिका के अंदर भी जो फ्यूल की प्राइसेस हैं और वहां पर खाने पीने की अशिया की प्राइसेस हैं, जिसकी कमी के ऊपर जो है डोनाल्ड ट्रंप को जो है वो वोट दिया गया था, उसकी वजह से जो है एक अनपॉपुलर जंग को रोकने के लिए अब एक एग्जिट स्ट्रैटेजी जो है वो तलाश जो है वो की जा रही है. इसके अलावा एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट ये है कि जो मिड टर्म इलेक्शंस हैं वो अमेरिका में जो है वो होने जा रहे हैं और इस जंग के मुहर्रिकात वहां पर डोनाल्ड ट्रंप की जो कांग्रेस में एक नुमाया बरतरी है उसके लिए भी एक मसला जो है वो बन सकती है. वापस आकर जो है अफगानिस्तान के इशू पर इनसे जो है वो बात करेंगे. हमारे साथ रहिए. वेलकम बैक नाजरीन. Adam, there's another conflict that's begun before the Iranian conflict was in hindsight. And that's the operation that Pakistan has launched inside Afghanistan, 𝐔𝐸𝐻, which it says is a counter-terrorism operation to end all those elements that have been supported by the Taliban. And the cross-border terrorism issue has been massive in Pakistan because statistics for themselves speak. I want your perspective on this. There's a lot of theory going around that it seems like both of these were planned. Do you think that there is any truth to all of it?
No, I don't think there's a semblance. These operations, if I understand the question correctly, that the operations, the counter-terrorism operations against the TTP and the operations against that are going on in Iran are somehow both planned? Or coordinated in some sense?
Yeah, that's the conspiracy theory that's actually making rounds, and that's what the Taliban media is pushing.
No, I don't think. This just represents the two, look, in the case of what's happening in Iran, I mean, that was completely the result of the United States and Israel's planning. And Pakistan makes sense as a mediator because it has strong relations with both the United States and Iran. It's not viewed as a vassal state the way that the Gulf countries are. It doesn't host U.S. troops and U.S. bases, and it hasn't been a victim of. Well, of course, it was a victim of Iranian aggression in 2024, but it hasn't been a victim of Iranian aggression as a result of this war. So that's why Pakistan has been chosen as a potential mediator. No, I mean that conspiracy theory holds no weight.
But in terms of the conflict or the escalation with Afghanistan, when we look at it from a global perspective, minusing the entirety of its local dynamics between bilaterals of Pakistan and Afghanistan, what's the perspective? We haven't seen a lot of condemnations coming in or a lot of resistance coming in for Pakistan's operation in Afghanistan. Is it that people are sick and tired of the Taliban's policy, or is that everybody diverted towards somewhere else?
Well, I mean, it's just the fact that the world's attention is distracted. I mean, there was the Pakistani airstrikes in Afghanistan barely made a blip in the news cycle because the world was so distracted with Iran and other issues. The Afghan Taliban don't have a lot of sympathy around the world. And, they've tried to play hardball with the Trump administration in terms of, just as an example, in terms of the U.S. hostages they have who they view as prisoners. And the Trump administration hasn't responded to that tactic. I mean, as usual, I think the Afghan Taliban, their shoes they've gotten a little too big for their shoes, as the expression goes. I mean, they think they can play hardball on the hostage issue with the U.S., with Pakistan. They think they can play hardball on the TTP issue. But I do understand that Pakistan is frustrated because diplomacy with the Afghan Taliban haven't worked. So I do understand that frustration.
But even like the Iranian war, what would be the ultimate outcome as an analysis? Because you've been a keen Afghanistan watcher. What do you think would be the ultimate outcome? It doesn't look like the Afghan Taliban would give up the TTP anytime soon.
No, they probably won't, because the TTP, first of all, they have family bonds with the TTP, ideological bonds. We've always talked about the pragmatism of the Afghan Taliban, but there's a limit to that pragmatism, as you know better than I do. They are still ideological at the end of the day, and I in some sense, I think they view the TTP as their own kind of strategic depth. So if I had to guess, I think the outcome is that Pakistan is going to have a tough neighbor in Afghanistan for years to come, and that there's going to be these periods of peace, followed by escalation, followed by talks, followed by a short period of peace, followed by an escalation, and that it's going to be difficult to deal with the Afghan Taliban for years to come. So I think Pakistan's going to have to compartmentalize its foreign policy a little bit, and we see it doing that. On the one hand, it's a potential mediator for a superpower and for its next door neighbor Iran, and it's seen as a peacemaker, and it's seen as a security guarantor in the Gulf. And on the other hand, it's fighting a counterinsurgency in the tribal areas. So we see these two realities existing side by side for Pakistan.
थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर योर टाइम मैडम। नाजरीन, गुफ्तगू आपने एडम की जो है वो सुनी, उस मैं समराइज करता हुआ चलूं तो जो अफगानिस्तान के अंदर पाकिस्तान का काउंटर टेररिज्म ऑपरेशन गजब लिल हक है, उनके मुताबिक जो वेस्टर्न ममालिक हैं और खुसूसी तौर पर ग्लोबल मीडिया, उसके अंदर कोई ऐसी स्टेटमेंट आई नहीं है जिसमें कोई रेजिस्टेंस जो है वो नजर आए पाकिस्तान के ऑपरेशन को, और उसकी वजूहात कई हैं। लेकिन सबसे बड़ी जो वजूहात है उसके लिए जो अफगान तालिबान के एटीट्यूड्स हैं और दुनिया का तंग आ जाना उनके बिहेवियर से, कि जिस तरह वो एक्ट कर रहे हैं, वो एक बहुत बड़ा पहलू है। और उन्होंने कहा कि अफगान तालिबान शायद अपने कद से बहुत ऊंचा जो है वो खेल रहे हैं, वो अमेरिका जैसे मुल्क के साथ भी एक ऐसी डिप्लोमेसी जो है वो रखना चाहते हैं जिसमें बार्गेन चिप के तौर पर उन्होंने प्रिजनर जो है वो रखे हुए हैं। और विजिबली जो दुनिया समझती है वो यही है कि जो पाकिस्तान का काउंटर टेररिज्म ऑपरेशन है वो विजिबल फ्रस्ट्रेशन की जो है वो निशानी है, क्योंकि पाकिस्तान के अंदर मेजर अटैक्स होते रहे हैं और इसके अलावा कोई और ऑप्शन बचता जो है वो नहीं है। प्रोग्राम के लिए अभी इतना ही, देखते रहिएगा बॉर्डर टॉक्स।